Welcome to Burning Platforms, our weekly look at the politics of technology, brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. I'm Peter Lewis. Joining me are Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea, Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton, and the Sizzle's Cam Wilson as we try to make sense of a world on fire. Well, hi guys. We're doing things a little bit differently this week. I think because we want to start moving to a more regular burning platforms, and that might not always involve finding guests we can schedule in. We've just decided to do a bit of an extended panel of what's the news this week. So we've got our regular team of Lizzie and Dan and the Sizzle's Cam Wilson joining us. It's kind of like a de facto panelist now. I think you're no longer a guest. You just turn up.
Fourth chair, thank you.
Yeah, part of the family, so welcome. But hi, guys. Hope everyone's well.
G'day, Peter.
Hello.
You can say hello too, Lizzie. Hello.
Hello.
Getting looser in the intros. But it feels like we have to do it weekly because so much is going on. And, you know, there hasn't just been, I think, a war in Iran launched this week. There's also been a war in the White House launched against Anthropic. And that's been a really, that's been quite a violent exercise in policy making, opening before our eyes. I know you've been following it closely, Cam. Do you want to just give us like the overview of what's going on, and then maybe we can unpick it between the different panelists, because there's a lot of moving pieces there.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the latest stuff that's been happening is that, one of the main AI companies, Anthropic, which is particularly buzzy at the moment because it's behind this AI product called Claude. It has been in actually a couple of weeks long standoff with the Pentagon and the Trump administration over the use of its AI technology by defense. I think this stems back to actually they signed a $200 million contract, or whatever that $200 million US, whatever that is in AUD today, a couple months back, as similar contracts were signed by a lot of the AI major companies, just to kind of say, hey, we'll get the availability in the door and we'll start using this. But since then, there's been this simmering conflict over the details of how the Department of Defense is allowed to use Anthropic's technology, specifically over Anthropic's two red lines, which is that they said, hey, we don't want you to use our products for mass domestic surveillance, and we don't want you to use it for autonomous killing or autonomous weapons. So we don't want this to be essentially used to pull the trigger on anything, and we don't want this to be doing this widespread surveillance. This finally came to a head on Friday when, after a lot of brinksmanship, Dario Amodei, who is one of the co-founders of Anthropic, said we're not doing it. Pete Hegseth, who's the Secretary of Defense, he was like, well, if you're not going to do it, we'll go with someone else. And also we're going to declare your product, your company, a supply chain risk, which is quite a punitive thing. So not only are we not going to obviously use your contract,
he made the point it's the first time that's ever been done against an American company. It's normally been done against foreign dictators.
Like Huawei, I think, was the last one because it's linked to China, and so this is kind of like, no pun intended, the nuclear option. And what it means is that if it's carried through, no company that essentially does work with the US government can also do work with Anthropic. So that's kind of where we've landed, this standoff over what the US government is allowed to use this technology for. Anthropic said, hey, this is our line. The US government said we want to be able to use it for any lawful measure. You can't pick and choose what it's used for. And at the end of the day, Anthropic stood their ground.
Lizzie, no surprise, Sam Altman was out there in like Flynn saying, we'll do it. But one of the arguments he was making, which I think is worth reflecting on, is that it shouldn't be up to tech companies to decide how governments are going to run their defense. Is there any merit to that argument? And would it be different if there wasn't a crazy person in the White House.
I mean, Google as well, right? I mean, this has caused some consternation among workers in these organizations as well. It's worth pointing out. Yeah, like it's an interesting standoff because they say that, you should have to comply with the law, and that's not, like, autonomous weapons aren't legal. It points to various provisions in American law that require this, and also mass surveillance isn't either, right? And so then the department says, well, you shouldn't have this as a condition of your terms of use. And the question is why, if that is the same as the law, right? So there's some nuance going on here, but I think it is also I don't think it's I understand the argument that tech CEOs aren't the people that should be deciding how tech is used in war, but I also think this is a way in which we get insight into how tech is being used in war that might not be compliant with the law in advance of huge amounts of mass human destruction that might also give us a sign that the tech's not being used in that way. So I think that's a convenient avoidance of this genuine discussion. I think it is reasonable if a company wants to have standards that are higher than the government and deploys its product in this way. In some ways, when I was looking at the interview, I thought to myself, oh, this is a selling point for this product, because there are lots of people who don't like the Trump administration and want to use an AI product that has some sense of morality or a moral compass. That is a niche in the marketplace that Anthropic has been playing to for a while. I don't know that this can necessarily hurt. And Amadei seems to at least think that that's what's going to happen. The actual prohibition on use is restricted to military contracts. It is, he refused to say it was an abuse of power, but the way in which it was explained by the administration was much more expansive, but designed to do damage to the company, I think, when it might not necessarily be true.
Dan, I don't know if you noticed that Claude did collapse under the weight of use for a couple of hours yesterday, and I don't know if that was correlation or causation, but is there a sense that Anthropic is emerging as the good AI? Obviously, Amadei broke with Altman and OpenAI over the choices Altman was making and the board was making over both safety and the not-for-profit mission. Is it too simplistic to say these are the good guys?
I mean, we don't know, right? Because we're never going to know exactly what they're doing. But I mean, the fact that they had a $200 million contract with the US Department of War
implies they're not the good guys.
Yeah, suggests that maybe those standards were already pretty wobbly. But I mean, that said, I don't want to be unfair to them, because it does seem like Amadei does take it at least more seriously than the other models do, and has put more guardrails in place, and publishes reports which are critical of the tech, including their own frequently, which is a lot more than what sort of ChatGPT or Gemini, and certainly what X is doing. So, I think I probably give them the benefit of the doubt to some extent, although, as I said, only to a limited amount, because they've still had that contract. I mean, I think the issue with this, right, is the law is not sufficient for this new technology, which is obviously a common problem. But I think there was two issues that he took issue with, or Claude took issue with, and that was the surveillance point, as you mentioned earlier, Cam, and the other one being autonomous weapons. I mean, I'm no lawyer again, but that the Fourth Amendment probably provides some sort of protection against mass surveillance against US civilians, I would have thought. But as far as I know, there is no law that prevents autonomous weapons being deployed. And so, I listened to this very disturbing interview recently with regular on this show, Toby Walsh, being interviewed by Josh Zepps this week, where they talked about just how autonomous weapons are now being deployed in war and how it's changing the nature of war. And it is genuinely scary. I mean, we are genuinely fast heading into a world, if we're not there already, which is pretty close to the Terminator. And so, I think, I don't know if there is a way that you can, be comfortable with the now US Department of War deploying this technology in any sense, if you're Anthropic. And so, maybe this will be good for business too, because if anything, it's just made a whole bunch of consumers sign up to their service that wouldn't have signed up to it before, and a whole bunch of churn from ChatGPT. Look, I don't know how to feel about this. I also have mixed emotions about it. I'm on Amadei's side in this circumstance, and I'm particularly concerned about the current administration. Would I feel differently if it was Biden and Altman, and the roles were reversed and all the power was flowing to Altman? I'd be probably taking a different position then. So it's a troubling one.
I would
Lizzie,
say,
it's worth noting.
I would say,
Go.
I would just
Go.
say, I was looking at a letter that was drafted by a couple of different groups about seeking an investigation into this that did point to a defense directive that talks about the need to have a quote unquote human in the loop for making decisions about weapons. So there is some basis for hanging your hat on the idea that this is unlawful, fully autonomous weapons. But like, I agree, the point still stands. The law remains unclear in this. Like a lot of people have been
that's just a
pushing.
directive, though, right? Like that's relatively easy to. I think it's DoD Directive 3000.09 is the
Yeah,
one.
but that
Oh,
exists.
just off the top of your head.
They know what it's talking about.
Just remember that familiar, yes. But anyway,
Hi, Cam. It's interesting. One point that I don't know slipped through. Anthropic is saying they're worried about spying on US citizens, but it seems like that's a closed class. They're planning to open up shop in Australia. I don't know if they've got contracts in Australia. And given our connection in with the American military and what we don't really know is going to happen as tech rolls out in AUKUS, should we be concerned that that is a pretty limited category rather than a general surveillance of citizens?
Yeah, I did note every time that the various tech CEOs were saying, well, you know, we'll only, you know, we'll make sure there's no mass domestic surveillance. And I'm, you know, down here in Australia being like, it'd be great if we had that kind of protection too. That'd be nice as well if you could think about us. So yes, Anthropic is setting up shop. They are working, for example, with you know, in the government's public service wide AI platform. You know, public servants are starting to trial it among other techs. So you know, they're down here. The really interesting thing is, like, when you talk about this stuff at a policy level, like, you know, contract level, you're saying it can't be used for X, Y, Z. But in terms of actually putting this in place and creating technical systems that stop this stuff, like, you know, it was raised to me a few times that, you know, how does something like ChatGPT or Claude know that the data that you've dumped into it is from mass surveillance, that it's come from some kind of unlawful way that it's obtained, versus, as we know, you know, Department of Defense does, where they just buy heaps of data from data brokers. They don't need to get a warrant. They've just said, hey, we've bought it. This is ours. We didn't need to get it. And now we can use that to surveil people. There is this question of, like, you know, even with America, which does have this stronger protection on the ideas of warrants, they're able to get around it through these commercial means. And, you know, it's the same with this autonomous, you know, killing as well, which is like questions about what does it actually mean to have a human in the loop. I know there's some distinctions about whether it means to be a human is responsible for the decision, or it's actually a human who is actually taking the decision. There's all these, like, you know, different aspects to it. And I think it really comes down to the fact that, like, trying to pass the, like, tweets of AI leaders to understand what exactly they've committed to is just no way to understand how this emerging technology is being used at the highest levels. Like, clearly we need, like, you know, laws about this stuff. I feel like this is something that we bang on about all the time. And, you know, in America, it's, you know, much worse than here in terms of their ability to actually pass legislation. But, and by the way, I think that's not a surprise why the Department of Defense is happily saying we can do whatever is, you know, lawful, considering there's just
that was Altman's thing as well, wasn't it? Yeah, like, we will use it for lawful means, and then
but we just can't, like, I mean, I feel like it's kind of like a basic thing, but, like, this can't go forward. There's just no way that this can be allowed to continue, because it's just it's impossible to kind of actually probably.
I'm glad you've said that, Cam. Now I want to
thank you.
Know you and whose army, because
exactly. I'm sure
seriously
taking note.
Can I make one more point before we move on? I think this will focus the minds, right? So, one of the things that I've just learned and wasn't thinking about previously was the reason this is important is shown particularly in Ukraine at the moment, right? So this is largely a drone warfare now, obviously. Now, but what's been happening in recent months, which I've just learned, is the drones which are controlled by a human are easily scrambled and taken out. And so the ways of getting around that up until recently have been with very long fiber optic cables. If you have a fully autonomous drone, it can absolutely operate completely independently without any human in the loop. And that is why this is important. But just imagine that scenario now about what warfare is going to become if that is effectively the standard. It's a pretty troubling future.
Well, we have prohibited chemical weapons. Do you know what I mean? Doesn't mean that they're not still used, but we draw lines in the sand regularly. It often takes a catastrophic episode of harm for that to occur. I'm not going to lie, but this is not an unprecedented situation in international law or even, subfields like the laws of war is what I would say.
And Toby, who you referenced earlier, Dan is over at one of these global conferences at the moment on this, so it'd be interesting to hear from him when he's back on whether there is. I think he's becoming increasingly pessimistic.
Black pilled.
That anything. Yeah, he's been coming white pilled. Yeah. Let's move on. Lizzie, still on surveillance. Our friends at the Human Technology Institute put a paper out this week looking at the spread of workplace surveillance, but also giving a really practical example of how the privacy reform, which Dan just loves, the fair and reasonable test, could actually be a way of dealing with workplace surveillance. Do you want to put the pieces together on that bit of work for us?
Yeah, so this is a snapshot report that's come out. It's the first stage of the work that UTS is doing, and they're seeking engagement for those who are interested. But it's talking about the use of surveillance in workplace settings. It talks about how unpopular this is with workers and the types of surveillance being used. So as we work more from home in particular, there are many ways, and often we are in a what might be considered traditional employment relationship. Many people work in more consultant roles or piecework roles or gig type roles. Then there is this increasing tendency towards engaging in forms of surveillance to track workers, and the kinds of ways in which this occur are also quite interesting. They're right on the edge, I think, in part because it's not a very well-regulated space, or it's regulated in quite a patchwork way. So this doesn't just include things like listening in to your microphone on a laptop. It might also be neurotechnology or technology that tracks biometrics on you, wearable technology, and then of course
your gait. I always love the surveillance of people's gait. It's meant to be the real tell to identify something.
Real tell, but also facial expressions and physicality, like emotional sentiment analysis is part of this surveillance. And there's a funny little example in the report where it talks about someone, I think it's the finance sector union, describes a situation where someone talked in a meeting about how it's unfortunately been quite rainy lately, and that was attributed to being too negative or whatever. So you can understand how there is great potential for this kind of surveillance technology to go wrong or be used in ways that people don't think are fair. But also it's just such an invasive experience being an employee where this kind of surveillance is possible and cheap and increasingly being deployed without appropriate regulation and oversight. So it's kind of a prime example of why you could, or how you could use a fair and reasonable test quite effectively to set the paradigm of what kind of workplace surveillance is acceptable. And using that human rights approach, like, are there alternatives that are less intrusive upon people's human rights? And what is the purpose? So asking those kinds of questions rather than allowing this kind of technology to roll out in a way that is not just largely unregulated, but almost by default in a lot of the systems.
A lot of it's built into the systems and no one's even asking, isn't it?
That's right. So this is a huge problem, right? Like, the capacity to switch it off might not be immediately obvious, might not even be obvious to employers that this is being collected. So having some greater thoughtfulness in how this kind of surveillance might be being used. I mean, it's one thing to ask that of employers, but also the products that were being sold. I think there's an argument that improved regulation around or introducing a fair and reasonable test would create a circumstance where suppliers of these kinds of products would be required to have different approaches to default switching on and off of this kind of tech. So there's lots of interesting stuff in there. And I think this is a particularly interesting field because unions are engaged on this topic. They understand the potential. I mean, one thing I think that isn't in the report that I'm kind of interested to explore is that there are other parts of the world where unions get the right to see the kind of surveillance that's being collected. And at the moment, that's not kind of discussed.
Where's that happening?
They're different in different agreements in places like the UK. It's like a reverse obligation. So I'm not sure how well this has survived with the kind of developments in the kind of surveillance tech space. But what I would say is I don't think that's a total answer to this. Like, I think there should be boundaries around the surveillance. But the point it highlighted to me is that it's a one-way dynamic, like it's all collected by the employer. And it's not always available to unions to use, for example, in relation to complaints or managing unreasonable workflows. Like, it's not as though that is the dynamic of collecting this information. There might be some potential for unions to use this in a particular way, but I think probably what we'll see is a growing agreement that there needs to be boundaries on the kinds of surveillance that can be done on workers. And it puts forward a strong case for a fair and reasonable test in the Privacy Act as the raw material that is used for this kind of surveillance and development of these systems.
And it was interesting, Dan, in the report to see the authors step out things that might pass the test, what would be grey and what would probably be no-go. As an evil employer, you look at those different usages. Like, does that feel fair and reasonable to you?
No, I mean, look, we've touched on this stuff before in workplaces, right? Like, I think ultimately, if as an employer, you should be pretty comfortable telling your workers all the surveillance if you're undertaking any of it that is being carried out.
The graph that they've put up. So things like communicating on work devices. Do you care if you're are the things in this graph relevant to your business and where your lines would be? Like, you're not monitoring your workers' facial expressions, I assume.
No. Just to clarify, there's no contemplation of that. No, but I think the lesson here is that just because the tech can do something now doesn't mean that you should do it, right? Like, I think it's the capabilities of technology, particularly with AI, are just getting more and more sophisticated, and facial expressions are reading facial expressions are going to become more and more accurate and whatever else. But we're going to end up in the matrix pretty quickly, right? Because you're going to have workplaces which are largely governed by the
only if we establish parallel universes, Dan.
It's true. Okay, so maybe we're not quite there yet, but it just none of this sounds fair and reasonable to me. I mean, I'd note probably an example which a lot of listeners would be familiar with, where new norms are being established in the workplaces in relation to these AI scribes that are now pretty persistent in most meetings, right? So now, by the way, we use them too on occasion, and they're very, very handy for some meetings. But what worries me is that the workplace, like as ever, is a place where this tech is just deployed without much thought. And then there's this new norm that everything you do is being recorded now, and I'm not sure that's going to be good for productivity and everything else besides, right? Because you're going to end up in a circumstance where people are going to be super careful about what they say and everything else. So, yeah, I just think again, you come back to the principle: if you're not comfortable telling your staff what you're doing, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. That doesn't sound fair and reasonable.
They do talk about productivity in this snapshot report, which I think is interesting. So I'm glad you raised that, because they do talk about how excessive surveillance isn't correlated with improved productivity, which makes sense to anyone who's been subjected to excessive surveillance. But they do talk about, like, it's quite politely worded. I think there's somewhere they talk about resistance or whatever. And then there is an example in there of Woolworths workers being made to comply with a certain pick rate that resulted in them going on strike. Like, people don't like it, right? So if you're rolling out this kind of high surveillance tech, you may have negative consequences within your workforce. It's really bad for culture as well, which is a big part of productivity.
Yeah, that's interesting. And Cam, there was a bit of analysis of Coles' decision to strike up a long-term deal with Palantir on this, which is, on one level, they're, again, linked into the military-industrial complex in the States, but they're basically a big data and analysis business. But it's not just a decision, like, on one level, better data, better outcomes, but it's also a particular way of looking at what productivity and a good workplace is, that's all being managed by a dashboard, right?
Totally. I mean, the things that I was thinking of is, one, like, just questioning both what gets measured and also how good these machines are at measuring it. I think people will set up ways to track people's performance that might kind of correlate to what they think about, like, smiling and looking happy at their desk, meaning that they're a good employee, but maybe they're just sitting at their desk playing Minesweeper or whatever. Exactly. Yeah. I think some of this surveillance stuff, ultimately gets you away from what are you trying to do as a business, and if you're making sure that someone's on the right Wi-Fi, is that really the be all and end all for how they're performing? Like, I don't know. I think obviously it's a little bit more complicated than just saying that there's obvious, performers, and that surveilling them is never going to be, important, because there's questions about sometimes, like, you pop up in a different country and you're on your computer. That's actually like a security risk to the company. So it is complex. But the other thing I was going to say is, like, often these technologies aren't that good. They aren't, like, I'm thinking to facial recognition, which has been rolled out for a long time and by a lot of companies, and many of them are not like the top of the line ones. And so, you get these like dodgy camera providers who've whacked on, oh, hey, we can do gait analysis, or we can do sentiment analysis on their faces, but they're not even accurate as well. And I think, like, we tend to, as a, people just tend to take these like technology providers' claims at face value. They say, well, if, they say they can do it, it's the magic of computing, but often they're actually not even working that well, which I think is a kind of important part of making sure that all of this is really closely scrutinized.
Well, any discussion about worker surveillance may soon be a moot point if the 2028 Global Intelligence Crisis Report, which was a piece of doom, horror, fan fiction, I guess you'd sort of call it. It was placed up on a Substack by a guy called Alap Shah, and I think it's a company called Citrini. It actually moved the market, Dan, and it set a pretty... This is a scenario where AI is not really bad, but it's does everything it says it's going to do, it a lot more. So you read it. You're coming off the back of your own palpitations after talking about the SAS Copolix last week. Does it scan like a credible scenario?
No, but I think it's interesting regardless, right? So, I mean, it's kind of a follow-on to the worst-case scenario of what we were discussing on the show last week, where, and as I said last week, I think we are going to see a huge amount of employment coming this year, particularly for entry-level jobs and the like. But yeah, I mean, just to give a bit more background on this, because some people might not have read it, and it was very long, I've got to say. So it was Citrini Research who published it. And it was this sort of fictional memo from June 2028. In this scenario, unemployment was over 10%, the S&P was down 38%, and companies were effectively laying off workers to invest in AI, which was resulting in more efficiencies, which resulted in more layoffs, and we're sort of stuck in this sort of doom spiral. Which,
but it set it out I thought it set out a credible scenario, particularly with the jobs were jobs that would employ service workers, so there's fewer service workers. But you take us through it.
Yeah, and look, I think there is some truth to it. I think there is likely to be a circumstance where that's going to happen, right? I think we're going to see that this year. I don't think we're going to see it in 2028. I think we're going to see that this year, but I don't think it's going to be widespread. And look, there's a lot of things that you can point out that are potentially wrong with this essay or this scenario, whatever you want to call it. But probably the fundamental thing that I think is wrong with it is it just assumes that with every bit of efficiency, people are just going to be laid off, rather than that increased productivity that's going to come is going to result in us doing a whole bunch more things and a whole bunch of new jobs being created, which is also going to happen. Now, the question is going to be, how fast is that going to happen versus how fast is there going to be job destruction? And my sense is that the job destruction is going to be in front for a period, but I don't think it's going to get to a point where it's just this self-reinforcing doom spiral. But look, I think where this is worth talking about, right, is we've touched on it before, but I think the reaction to this is what's important. The market's had another sell-off as a result to it, and the key point that I think everyone needs to pay attention to is that it's built on the assumption that all of these productivity gains are coming from large language models, and those large language models, there are really three that count: Anthropic, OpenAI, and Gemini, Google Gemini, right? So I think the concentration of power that is going to come as more and more of the economy is being built on those models is the point that is relevant here. And there's lots of people that are assuming that if they get to any form of super intelligence, that these models will be able to do everything. I think that's ridiculous, by the way. I think it's going to end up being the reverse, where there's a whole bunch of other companies which are built on top of these models, and they're going to be more like infrastructure, very sophisticated infrastructure. But I still think you think about that world, right? We're going to be in a circumstance where it's not just your Google search and your social network, which is built on top of a platform in the US. it's like literally thousands and eventually millions of businesses that are being built on top of these models. And the concentration of power that gives to these three companies is going to be remarkable, unlike any concentration of power we've ever seen. And I'm not sure they're all going to behave as ethically as Amadeus, which is the concern.
Cam, you were pretty scathing of this in our little personal exchanges.
Yeah, I was. Maybe I should start off with a something nice, which is that it's glad to see that in this, this age of AI, that the humanities, that fiction can still, move the market. That's a really, really nice thing. So good for the arts. Yeah, I mean, I didn't. I mean, I'm kind of like sometimes I feel like I'm a nothing ever happens kind of guy, where I'm like, things always move much slower than we imagine, particularly at the cutting edge where there's a lot of hype around things. The time that all this stuff will take to filter through, even just using the technology that's available now, I think will take quite a long time. The other thing, just one thing that Dan mentioned that I thought is kind of interesting is that, I mean, I think like I have these deep worries about the same centralization of power among these three companies. But the thing that has really interested me over the last 2 years is how there's been a constant drumbeat of open source models. So like your DeepSeeks, a lot of them from China, that are somewhere between 6 to 12 months behind the cutting edge. And importantly, like a lot of them have been able to be running locally. Like I run a very, very basic LLM on a very low powered computer just to do some very, very basic stuff, just to play around with it. That kind of stuff does give me some hope that actually that these companies might not have this like incredible incumbent advantage that everyone else needs to build on it, because I think there's a real desire for everyone else not to have to be relying on these companies and their cloud providing, and actually being able to run stuff ourselves. So, but yeah, on the report, I wasn't a huge fan, and I think that I fundamentally believe that if if people save money because everything gets more efficient and more productive, then people will just find new things that they want to waste their money on, and that will create jobs for all of us.
Can I just pick up on one thing that you said there? Sorry to jump in again. We touched on this again last week, and I should have said it then, but I'll say it now. I hope you're right, Cam, and that some of these open weight models are good enough, but they're nowhere near good enough now. Like, and as a business which is building on top of these frontier models, it's not even a question of whether you would use any of these open weight models. You just wouldn't. They're nowhere near as good. Even I think they're more than 6 months behind. And the issue is that you're also getting if you build on top of the frontier models, you get the benefits that are constantly being rolled out to those models, which you don't get in an open weights model, which if you build on it locally. So I'm just not sure that. I mean, I'm sure that will happen to an extent, but I don't think it will happen for most companies, and that's what worries me.
Did you make it through the fan fiction, Lizzie?
Oh, man, no. Okay, I'm just leaving it to you guys.
But where I thought I would bring you in, one of the interesting things when Cam and I was bantering was that there was a prediction market came out saying there was a 1 in 10 chance of this being true. And that got me wondering a bit about how these prediction markets are working. And you've written a bit about this, and I think you've got an interest in this, Lizzie, with your work historically with gambling reform as well, because it seems like these prediction markets are actually a new form of sports bet, aren't they?
It's like when Nate Silver said, "Oh, I gave Trump a 1% chance of winning. That means he could have won on my model." And I'm like, yeah, I know, but what do you think the point is of giving it a percentage? Like,
so you can create a market. So, but you wrote also about a lot of people just watching the war and jumping on prediction markets, Cam. Like, what's going on and why is it a thing at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So prediction markets are shall we say, a new kind of approach to putting money on things, I guess, or wagering on outcomes. The two major companies, Polymarket and Kalshi, kind of say, hey, we're different to betting because we're allowing you to, we're not technically like it's on the outcome. It's, you can trade options. So you can say, hey, I think there's a 90% chance that this will happen, so I'll buy this at 90 cents. And then if, the possibility event goes down, you can sell it off. So there is a kind of
Why
financialization.
is that not gambling?
Isn't that futures trading?
Yeah, I know. I mean, but then you start to get some questions about finance as well. But there is a kind of minor distinction. I should know that in Australia we actually have our online gambling regulator has ruled that Polymarket is gambling and not a financial product, so it is actually banned in Australia. But it has become very popular over the last few years, particularly in the US. Funny enough, they were kind of behind us a bit in sports betting, but now they've gone fully for it. And these prediction markets have largely been able to avoid a lot of the stricter gambling regulation in the US. But one of the kind of wild things you can do in these prediction markets is that there are markets on almost anything, and there's been markets on whether famine will be declared, or whether certain towns in Ukraine will be taken by Russia, and most recently on when there will be a strike against Iran. And
you could see Don Jr. getting busy, couldn't you?
Yeah, and he's actually a investor in, I think, Polymarket.
Oh no, I was only joking. I shouldn't have joked.
And an advisor to Kalshi, the competitor, at the same time, which is just you got to give credit to him. He's really, he's making the most of it.
In every pie.
Yeah, but I think I read something today saying that within the first day of strikes on Iran by the US, there was $550 million of wages and I guess products bought. Some person won $800,000 by betting on strikes happening just a couple of hours before they happened. Who knows if they had any inside knowledge? But these companies are saying, hey, we're actually performing service because we let you understand the world. We provide a new source of information. I guess people are technically, using this to maybe make other decisions off. Other people just say it's a new form of gambling. There's not a whole lot of value being created, but it is just really it is becoming hugely popular in the US and is very quickly going to overtake actual traditional sports gambling in terms of revenue. And it really just seems like it's enmeshed in news organizations over there as well. So it is a new trend. It's relatively new, but it is seriously gathering steam.
And have we stopped it in Australia at this stage, or we're just saying it's gambling?
So Polymarket got...
Which means it can still advertise and do everything.
You're not actually supposed to so Australia's online gambling laws means that you're not supposed to if you're not a registered online gambling company. So Polymarket was not
to register.
Hasn't registered, so it's bad. It's actually blocked. Australian ISPs have to block it. Kalshi, actually just checked today, is still available in Australia, but I don't think ACMA has kind of taken any action against it yet.
Mm-hmm. So interesting. Hey, I'm going to finish off with my contribution, which is a bit of a debate that is emerging about what is a left position on AI, which I'm interested in unpicking. But I want to start off with a bit of a confession, especially to you, Lizzie. I've been holed up in my South Coast retreat for the last week playing with Claude, and I did it very mindfully on the basis that to critique you need to understand how the tech works. But it's been very, I've found it, and I don't want to be the guy that discovers AI and goes, ooh, but there's been some really there's some interesting things. So, firstly, in terms of processing lots of information, so a big project, and I've written 8 or 10 different reports, and I just could not get my head around it. And feeding those into a model, then asking questions about the linkages and contradictions and things like that, really, really useful. But also, the other bit that struck me was that you've got to, I went in and said, don't, anthropomorphize yourself. Don't suck up to me. I don't want you to be a sycophant. And it defers back to that all the time. And it struck me that if I'd been the same kind of, wild man away with none of those barriers, I'd probably be falling in love with my AI by now, because it's limitless in the way it's going to reinforce back to you. And I know this is no news to anyone, but it just strikes me that so while I was doing that, I was reflecting on an article that I think Amy might have sent from Transformer News by a guy called Dan Kagan-Carnes, which was basically saying the left is getting it all wrong on the way that we approach AI because we say it's bad, like that, and they call out people like Emily Bender, who's got the whole sarcastic parrot shtick that it's really not doing anything that impressive. And then Dan's favourite commentator, Ed Zitron, and Cory Doctorow, and like all these people that say it is bullshit, but it feels to me that the bigger problem isn't that it's bullshit, but it is potentially it does some really, really clever and interesting and potentially, I don't know if it's transforming the world, but there's a different way of saying this is bad because it's bad and this is bad because it's good. And I still think we're trying to think that through. You then sent me Brian Merchant's riposte on that, which you might like to summarise, which I also think is quite compelling. But I do think it talks to the fact that I feel like the left is still working out where to go in terms of, we did this when we were on the road. Do you resist? Do you regulate? Do you reimagine? Is it a little bit of all of it? But interesting week to be having that debate going while I'm sort of challenging my own way of interacting with the technology as well.
Yeah, I mean, I read the original kind of article or essay in Transformer, and it did feel like a sort of non-leftist view of what the left says about AI. Thanks very much. I'm not sure this is very helpful or well intended, right? And so that's the starting point for the criticism. I think that so to give you an insight into what Brian Merchant thinks, which I think well worth your time in terms of reading, is he makes the point that a lot of what the left criticizes about AI is shared by many people in the community. Like very large numbers of people are not optimistic about this technology, have worries about it, want it to be better regulated, aren't particularly they don't trust technology companies. And that comes from a long history of them not doing anything to earn people's trust, right? So then, Brian talks about all the different things that the left is trying to grapple with, and I think that it's been unfair to characterize the left in a particular way on this front. But there are a lot of people who are putting forward analysis and discussing and thinking through the material components that go into AI and what the consequences might be. The Stochastic Parrots paper actually talks about how, if you might want to use a large language model for a particular purpose, one of the first things you need to think about is the environmental constraints that need to be applied to use it sustainably, which is a part of the paper that I think is often kind of ignored. It's in the kind of second half. And I think that's a valid point. Lots of people are now engaging with this question. As data centers are springing up across the United States, many communities feel pretty put upon by that experience and are concerned about the climate implications of it. So a very material understanding of what this technology means, not some philosophical question of not getting on board with the good bits, but understanding how it can be, or how it isn't being imposed upon, I'll start that again. I think quite clearly the left brings to the table a set of analyses that describe how AI is being imposed on people and why they don't like it. And that's a valid criticism. That does leave open the possibility of different ways of making use of the technology. Like even Karen Howe in her book called Empire of AI, she talks about examples of particularly small language models where we are neglecting the potential of those kinds of applications because so much of how we think and talk about AI or this new form of technology is oriented towards large foundational models and a very small number of companies. So those power dynamics are important. You can't just ignore them in order to have a philosophical debate about AI. They are central to how it's being imposed on people, but also the ways in which people are starting to resist. So I mean, Brian does it better than I'm doing it now, but I think there's some utility in thinking through the different ways in which a left or a critical thinking analysis of this technology feeds into or dovetails into a longer critique of capitalism, of exploitation by businesses, of markets, of natural resources, of labour, and then understanding how that works in relation to what is in some ways an interesting, like people talk about it as not a particularly fancy or new technology, but in some ways is an interesting technology because it's so influential in our world, but in some ways is a continuation of a trajectory of a relationship between capitalism and technology that's been going for a long time.
Notwithstanding Lizzie's spray, that article resonated with you, Dan, didn't it?
Oh, here we
Yeah,
go.
I mean, I think I broadly agree with Lizzie's takedown of it, I would say.
Yeah,
but where the parts of it that resonated with me was, I think, and this is a general statement, obviously it's not true of every person on the left and whatever else, but the focus on the environmental impact of data centers and the fact that communities don't want those and those sort of things, and I think the dismissal of the potential of the technology, which I think is, I don't know if that's a left-right thing, but that is certainly taking place. I think what that does is we're missing the biggest, as we just touched on, we're missing the biggest concentration of power in the history of mankind. And that is something that the left should care about, right? Because that if we don't start to think about where this is going really quickly, we're going to end up in a circumstance which is far worse than anything we've been complaining about with Google and Facebook for the last decade. It's going to be even worse. And that concentration of power, concentration of wealth is going to is going to be very unfair for a whole bunch of people, particularly in a country like Australia where we're not going to be able to control any of this, right? And that's where I think there's a role for the left to play that is probably not being as vocal, at least in my very anecdotal take on this and everything that I'm reading. I'm not seeing enough people care about what the implications of that are going to be and what we need to do as a society to make it fairer and make sure that the benefits of this amazing tech are distributed fairly. I haven't seen enough of that, and that's probably the part of it that resonated.
Cam, one of the things that I think is so alluring about tech as a policy area is that some of the political fault lines are still being developed in real time. How do you see it as someone that's trying to cover it more from the industry perspective, that obviously with a political overlay?
I think the thing that probably frustrates me most about the reaction to it, particularly from that left, I mean, I guess I don't think it's a perfect mapping, but you call it the kind of anti-AI movement, is that I think there's a real, people aren't separating the technology from the forces behind it. And I know that they are not, you literally can't separate them. But in terms of being able to think about the technology on its own is important to be able to understand, well, where's it going to go? Like, where are things going to go and what is possible? And so by that, I mean, I think there's a lot of people who used maybe ChatGPT or whatever early on, kind of was like, at the time it was a lot more basic than it is now. I've mostly seen, slop pictures on my Facebook or Twitter feed. And that's kind of all I think that it can kind of do. Whereas clearly there has been some bigger breakthroughs, particularly I think over the last year with some of the core code stuff. All that to say is I think clearly the technology has proven itself to be interesting, and I don't know how we define, there's questions about whether it's a normal technology or a transformative one, but it clearly has opened up a new way of computing that I think is interesting and useful. And I think there's going to be a lot of benefits out of it just from learning how to use it. Then there's the question about how do you actually use it at scale? I mentioned before that local running your own open weight stuff. I actually do run my own little one at home to do a little summarization and a few things. I do think there is actually a way that in some ways has actually been able to help me move away from my reliance on big tech, because I've been able to use it to do more self-hosting stuff, because it, to put it simply, it allows me to talk in normal human language and then for it to be translated into computer programming. So I can actually run stuff that I haven't been able to have the technological, know-how in the past. And then there's the question about, how are we actually going to build the infrastructure? We've got these data centers that are already being built in Australia. And I think by just kind of saying, we can't build these full stop, and believing that maybe this technology will go away and all the demand for the data centers will go away, I just don't think is going to happen. And I think then if you kind of accept that there's a good chance that it's going to be here, and think about how can we actually use that to our advantage as a country, as a nation, as a people, there are things that I think that we should be thinking about. For example, are we going to try and have some kind of I almost think royalty system for big tech companies to have the data centers here in Australia, which they really want. I think there's almost a parallel to how we to mining and thinking about them as a kind of extractive technology that actually, if they are to exist in our areas, in our communities, then maybe we should be thinking about how we can benefit, the rest of us. And it got pointed out to me by someone, an Aussie in San Francisco who works in this AI safety area, who just said this last week of the Anthropic Department of Defense stuff is kind of one of the worst case scenarios from the perspective of who controls AI, the stuff they've been talking about. But if they have data centers in places like Australia, that means that all of a sudden these companies are less reliant and less controlled by one country, one government, and actually means that Australia has more of a say over it. So, you kind of think about data centers and you're like, oh, like, all the stuff that has been brought up about their cost on the community, but it's also a point of leverage for our country.
The thing that gets me is they just don't even bother to do the cost benefit analysis on the energy. They just say it's good, so accept it. Like, I feel, and it goes back to Lizzie's point, and maybe the difficult thing is it's not one politics, it's multiple politics. There's environmental politics, there's labor politics, it's cultural politics, and then there is, the power of the big corporations. And I feel that's the bit that we're still struggling to stitch together. Maybe we just that's why we need a weekly burning platforms, obviously. But I don't know if we'll solve it in one go.
One more thing into the mix. Like, this is a story I did want to talk about in some format or another that's been circulating.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah. So the other way in which I think the left, to the extent these terms are all definable, contributes to the discussion about AI is that routinely these are the people doing the work to raise the harm. There's this common thing in tech policy spaces that men run all the companies and women work and run all the organizations that are designed to hold them accountable. Like, there's so much work being done to try and reshape how this technology works, to do the heavy lifting of being the feedback loop that the companies don't want to do, right? Like, they want to privatize the gains, socialize the harms. That people have to suffer as they must, right? And they will, that is their approach. I mean, there's a long history of that in capitalism, but the story I wanted to talk about just quickly is one that's been circulating for a little while, but it's about a AI agent that was sent by a person to contribute a pull request to an open source code project. And that was rejected by the person who was administering that project. And the agent then proceeded to go and do research and author a hit piece on the person administering the code project to say that he was putting ego ahead of open source values, right? So the point of this is that an AI agent was instructed to do a job. When it was denied the possibility of doing that work, it then went and did something that looks like character assassination, right? Now, there is a bit more complexity to this, how this actually worked, whether the person who was operating the agent knew about this or...
Was it Grok?
Sorry?
Was it Grok?
No, it was... well, look, I mean, there's you can read all about it if you want to, but I point still...
We'll put a link to it in the show notes. There's been some really interesting articles. We should do a big
really
bunch of links. Yeah.
But the point, of course, is that agents is something that people talk about all the time as being a way in which you can avoid having to do personal admin, how we can accelerate business processes. But the capacity to provide guardrails around what that agent can and can't do without, pretty decent amounts of human supervision, which undermine the productivity promises of these agents, right? It's quite clear that it's difficult to instruct an agent not to do all the things that, even if they're not in breach of the law, it's still things that we wouldn't want them to do, right? And you can sort of imagine, like, if I was the person running that, the first thing I think an agent might do is create a deep fake sexually explicit imagery of me and start posting it going, this woman is not to be trusted. Like, you can imagine how it can become really nefarious really quickly. And you might not, or if you're a public figure, of course, you could be much more susceptible to this, like mass activity designed to undermine your reputation in circumstances where there are freely available tools to do that right now, right? So there's a dangerous environment to be letting loose a dangerous technology. And we are told that this is worthwhile because of productivity benefits, with no real interest in hearing when it's going wrong. So it's the job of civil society organisations, academia and the like, advocates, community organisations to elevate this into the discussion. Otherwise, it would not be on the agenda. That is the reality, right? So that is, I think, a very important contribution that progressives, critics, members of the community add to this discussion. And
doesn't feel like a left-right thing. It just seems like a citizen thing, doesn't it?
Sure.
Maybe that's become left. Yeah. Final thoughts, reflections, or should we put a pin in it?
I'll say one observation quickly, because there was another version of what you just described. I don't think we spoke about it on this show with the whole open claw thing, where basically, a social media network for agents was set up, and we saw lots of examples of these agents going and doing things like doxing real life humans and doing all kinds of very nefarious things. I think there's another lesson of this, which, well, not another lesson, but the lesson of this is that this tech is, if it's deployed without guardrails, it can genuinely be unsafe. And I think,
but it is being deployed without. It's not a can, it's an is. Final thought: we sit here and have these interesting discussions every week. Are we just fiddling while Rome burns? Is this, like you said, it's not moving that fast, Cam? But is this
no. It's definitely moving fast at the edges. I'm just saying for your auntie to have a open core setup. Like I'm not assuming she's going out and buying a Mac Mini this week to do that. But I mean, it is moving very, very fast at the edges, and I think it's worth being scared, if not for the massive impact it's having now, but for where you project that this stuff will go if it continues.
It's moving fast enough that we should have a weekly burning platforms, I think, Peter. That's the lesson.
On that note, we will see you next week. We've got the former chief scientist Alan Finkel booked in, and Alan has launched a new initiative called Holy Human, which is all about trust marking AI creative content. So that should be a great discussion on where those lines lie. But thanks, guys. Thanks. It was a fun discussion just to have the panel together. Dan, Lizzie, Cam, thanks for being with us, guys.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Burning Platforms, recorded on March 4 and produced on NAM land by Rebecca Connell. Talk again soon.